Lars wasn't a man easily shaken. As the village undertaker, he had seen his fair share of death, loss, and grief. In a small, remote village tucked away in the Norwegian countryside, death was as much a part of life as the harsh winters and the short, fleeting summers. But today, something felt different. Something was wrong. It was early morning when he arrived at the graveyard, a light mist curling around the headstones, dew clinging to the uncut grass. The sky was a dull gray, typical for the time of year, and the wind carried a chill that seeped into Lars's bones. He had come to check on the graves after the recent storm, expecting nothing more than a few fallen branches or loose earth. But then he saw it. Bjorn's grave, the one he had buried barely a month ago, was disturbed. The earth had been violently churned, dirt flung in every direction, as if something or someone had dug its way out. Lars froze, his breath catching in his throat. The coffin's lid was splintered, cracked open from the inside, the wood jagged and raw. For a moment, Lars didn't move. His heart hammered in his chest, and his mind raced to find a logical explanation. Wild animals, maybe? But no, the grave had been too deep, the coffin too solid for that. A prank? But who would desecrate a grave, especially Bjorn's? Summoning his courage, Lars crouched down and peered into the open coffin. The body inside was in a state far worse than decay should allow. Bjorn's once peaceful face was contorted, as though he had fought something in his final moments, and his limbs, twisted, broken, looked like they had been gnawed upon. Lars could feel the bile rise in his throat, the smell of death overpowering. But there was something else, something darker, fouler than the usual stench of the dead. A smell that clung to the air like rot, but older, more ancient. The stories from his childhood flooded back to him. The tales his father had told around the fire, stories of the Draugr, undead spirits who rose from their graves to haunt the living. He had always dismissed them as folklore, tales to scare children into behaving. Now, standing over the mutilated body of Bjorn, Lars wasn't so sure. His hands trembled as he straightened up, eyes scanning the graveyard, half expecting to see something moving among the headstones. But everything was still, too still. He stumbled back, the weight of dread heavy on his chest. This wasn't the work of animals or vandals. Something had risen from that grave, and it wasn't finished. Lars could feel it in his bones. This was just the beginning. The smell lingered, like a sickness that refused to leave. Lars had thought it would pass after he left the graveyard, after he turned his back on the disturbed earth and the broken coffin. But the stench of decay clung to him, as if something had followed him home. He scrubbed his hands furiously at the small wash basin in his cabin, the rough bar of soap barely producing any lather. He could still smell it, rot, foul and heavy, creeping into his clothes, his skin, his hair. It was the kind of smell that made your stomach turn and your body itch, the kind that seemed to crawl into your nose and refuse to let go. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, making the bare branches scrape against the windows like skeletal fingers. The gray sky had given way to a deeper gloom, thick clouds heavy with the promise of more rain. Lars glanced around his small cabin, usually so comforting in its simplicity. The wooden walls, the small stone fireplace, the table cluttered with books and tools. His life as the village undertaker had always been solitary but peaceful. Now the space felt suffocating, as though the walls were closing in. He threw the towel down and stepped outside, hoping the fresh air would clear his mind. But the smell followed him, lingering just behind him like a shadow. It wasn't just the grave anymore. There was something more. Something foul had awakened, and no matter how much he scrubbed or how deeply he breathed, he couldn't shake it. The village lay quiet at this time of day. No one worked in the fields now, not with winter coming and the frost biting at the soil. Smoke curled lazily from a few chimneys, and the faint sounds of distant hammering drifted from the blacksmith's shop. Yet there was an eerie stillness that hung over the place, something he hadn't noticed before. Perhaps it was the storm that had unsettled everyone, or perhaps it was just him, his own paranoia gnawing at his nerves. Lars moved around the side of his cabin, looking toward the forest beyond. The trees stood like dark sentinels, their tops swaying gently in the wind. He felt a presence, something lurking just out of sight, watching him from the cover of the trees. His dog Kjetil sniffed the air uneasily, whining as he edged closer to Lars's leg. "You smell it too, don't you?" Lars muttered, rubbing the dog's head absently. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The rot wasn't just in the graveyard. It was spreading, seeping into the village, into his home, into his very skin. It was as if the earth itself was tainted, poisoned by whatever had disturbed Bjorn's grave. Whatever it wasn't done with him. Not yet. And as the wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest whisper of something unnatural, Lars knew, deep down, that it was only going to get worse. The village tavern was always a warm, bustling place, even in the colder months. It was where the men gathered after a long day's work, where stories were shared over mugs of ale, and where the old-timers spun their yarns about days long past. But today the usual hum of conversation was subdued, the air thick with an undercurrent of unease. Lars pushed open the heavy wooden door, a gust of cold air following him inside. The smell of smoke and sweat mixed with the ever-present scent of old ale. But even here, in the warmth of the tavern, Lars couldn't escape the lingering stench of rot. He could still feel it clinging to him, a sickly reminder of what he had seen earlier in the graveyard. As he made his way to a corner table, the room fell quiet for a moment. The villagers, always polite but distant toward Lars, watched him as he passed. Their eyes were full of something new this time, something more than the usual curiosity or wariness they felt toward the man who handled their dead. Now, there was suspicion. Old man Eirik was hunched over the bar, his gnarled hands wrapped around a mug, his voice a gravelly murmur. Lars could hear him muttering something under his breath as he spoke to the blacksmith John. John, a broad-shouldered man with a stern face, was listening intently, nodding along to whatever Eirik was saying. "They say Bjorn's grave was dug up," Lars overheard Eirik whisper. "Mangled, like some beast got to it." John frowned. "Beast, you think?" Eirik shook his head, his eyes darting toward Lars before turning back to John. "Not a beast. No animal does that to a man's body, not after it's been buried. No, this is something older, something darker." Lars felt a chill run through him. He could guess where this was going. Eirik had always been one for the old stories, the legends of the Draugr, the undead who rose from their graves to torment the living. Stories most people dismissed as nothing more than superstition. But in the quiet of the tavern, with the wind howling outside and the weight of the recent deaths hanging over them, the stories felt more real than ever. John leaned in closer to Eirik. "You think it's the Draugr?" Eirik nodded slowly. Bjorn wasn't a good man, and everyone knows it. There were grudges, scores left unsettled. They don't rest easy, those who died with a heart full of hate. Lars clenched his jaw, trying to ignore the growing knot in his stomach. the Draugr were supposed to be just myths, tales to keep children from wandering too far into the woods at night. But the sight of Bjorn's mangled body had shaken him. Could it really be something unnatural? The tavern's murmurs grew louder as the rumors spread like wildfire, passing from one table to the next. Faces turned to Lars, their expressions dark and suspicious. He could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken accusation hanging in the air. Lars didn't want to believe it, but deep down, a cold realization had begun to take root. If the old stories were true, then whatever had risen from Bjorn's grave wasn't finished yet. And Lars knew, without a doubt, that it was coming for him next. The night was thick with silence, the kind of quiet that settles deep in the bones. Lars lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the day pressing down on him. The smell of rot still clung to his skin, no matter how many times he washed. He had tried to push the thoughts of Bjorn's grave from his mind, but the image of the unearthed coffin, the mangled body, and the whispers of Draugr haunted him. Outside, the wind rustled the branches, the only sound breaking the oppressive stillness. Lars's dog Kjetil shifted uneasily at the foot of the bed, ears twitching as though he sensed something beyond the walls. Lars told himself it was just the wind, just the typical sounds of the countryside at night. But a knot of unease had taken hold in his gut. And then, faintly at first, came the sound. A soft thud, like a footstep outside his window. Lars froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He listened, straining to hear more, and there it was again, a slow, deliberate step. It wasn't the casual crunch of an animal moving through the woods. This was something heavier, more deliberate. Kjetil let out a low growl, his fur standing on end. Lars sat up in bed, his body tense, every instinct screaming at him to stay quiet, to not draw attention. He reached for the oil lamp on the bedside table, his fingers trembling slightly as he lit the wick. The soft glow filled the room, casting shadows that flickered and danced against the walls. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the crackling of the lamp's flame. Then came a new noise. Closer this time, a scraping, like something dragging across the wooden exterior of the cabin. Lars's heart raced as he swung his legs out of bed and moved toward the window. Kjetil following close behind, his growls growing more intense. Slowly, Lars pulled back the curtain, peering into the dark. His breath caught in his throat. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure. It was tall, hunched, and unmoving, its silhouette barely visible in the dim moonlight. Lars squinted, trying to make out any details, but the figure remained still, shrouded in shadow. The air around it seemed to ripple, the mist clinging to its form. He watched for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the figure to move, to approach. But it never did. It simply stood there, staring, or at least Lars felt like it was staring, through the darkness. His hand trembled as he reached for the door, but when he stepped outside, there was nothing. The figure was gone, leaving behind only the cold, heavy air and the lingering certainty that something unnatural had been watching him. Lars had always known about Ingrid. Everyone in the village did, though most preferred not to speak of her. She lived deep in the woods, beyond where most dared to venture, in a cabin that looked like it had been swallowed by the forest itself. The old woman had a reputation, a keeper of the old ways, they said. She knew things, ancient things, whispered about in hushed tones when the nights were long and cold. But today, Lars had no choice. He needed answers. The path through the woods was thick with underbrush. the trees towering overhead, their bare branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The further Lars walked, the more oppressive the air became. It wasn't just the cold that chilled him to the bone, it was the feeling that the forest itself was alive, watching him. The smell of rot that had clung to him since the night before seemed stronger here, heavier. He had barely slept, haunted by the image of that figure standing at the edge of the woods. He needed to know what was happening, and Ingrid was his last hope. When Lars finally reached her cabin, it was nearly dusk. The wooden structure looked as though it had been grown out of the earth itself, moss and vines clinging to its roof, the windows fogged with years of neglect. Lars hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the rough wood, unsure whether to knock or turn back. Before he could make up his mind, the door creaked open, revealing Ingrid standing in the doorway. She was smaller than he remembered, her back hunched with age, her hair a wild tangle of gray. Her eyes, though, they were sharp, piercing, as if they could see straight through him. "I knew you'd come," she said, her voice low and gravelly, with the weight of someone who had lived far too many years. She stepped aside, gesturing for Lars to enter. Inside, the cabin was dark and cramped, cluttered with strange objects. Bundles of dried herbs, old books, and jars filled with things Lars didn't want to identify. A fire crackled weakly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Ingrid sat at a small table and motioned for Lars to join her. "You've disturbed something that should have been left alone," she said, not waiting for Lars to explain why he was there. Lars felt a chill creep down his spine. "The grave? Bjorn, I didn't mean to." "The Draugr," Ingrid interrupted, her eyes locking onto his. "Once awakened, they do not rest until they've claimed what they're owed." Lars swallowed hard. "How do I stop it?" Ingrid's face darkened. "You don't. But you can try to protect yourself, though even that may not be enough." She slid a small carved rune across the table. "Keep this with you, and pray it's enough to keep the dead at bay." The atmosphere in the village had shifted, and Lars could feel it as soon as he returned from Ingrid's cabin. There was something in the air, a tension, almost palpable, like a string pulled too tight, ready to snap. The villagers moved about their routines, but they were quieter, more withdrawn. Eyes that used to offer casual nods of acknowledgement now darted away when they met Lars's. Conversations ceased when he entered a room, and people hurried past him with murmured excuses. It wasn't just him, though. The village itself seemed to be reacting to whatever had been disturbed. The animals were skittish. Lars had seen chickens scattering for no reason, and dogs barking at nothing but the wind. Even the livestock were affected. Several sheep had died mysteriously in their pens, and the blacksmith's prized mare had fallen ill, her once shiny coat now dull and patchy. At the general store, Lars overheard snippets of conversation. The younger villagers dismissed the recent deaths and strange occurrences as coincidences. They blamed the harsh winter approaching or the sickness that sometimes swept through the region this time of year. But the older folks, those who had lived through the worst times, whispered about darker things. Lars caught fragments of their hushed voices as they huddled by the fire, casting wary glances in his direction. "They say Bjorn's grave was found open," one of the old men muttered. "His body, twisted like he fought something in the earth." Another nodded grimly. "I heard it too, and Lars, he was the one who found it. Bad luck follows the one who disturbs the dead." The hairs on the back of Lars's neck stood on end as he walked by, pretending not to hear. He could feel their stares burn into his back as he exited the store. The rumors were spreading fast, and so was the fear. Back at the tavern that evening, the tension was even worse. The warm glow of the hearth seemed dimmer, the laughter more strained. The usual crowd was there, but they huddled together in small groups, speaking in hushed voices. Lars sat alone, nursing his drink. The weight of the rune Ingrid had given him heavy in his pocket. He could feel eyes on him, hear the whispers circulating just beyond his hearing. "They say it's the Draugr," one voice whispered, barely audible over the crackling fire. Bjorn wasn't the only one wronged in his death. Others will pay too. Lars' grip tightened around his cup. The feeling of dread that had been simmering since the graveyard was now impossible to ignore. The village was unraveling, and Lars could sense it. The sickness, the deaths, the unease, it was spreading like a sickness, and he was at the center of it all. He glanced out the window into the growing darkness. The wind howled, carrying with it the faintest sound of something far more sinister, lurking beyond the edge of the village. The next morning, Lars sat at his kitchen table, staring at the papers scattered before him. The early light filtered through the small window, but it did little to ease the darkness hanging over him. His mind was racing, filled with pieces of a puzzle he was just beginning to understand. Something terrible had been set into motion, and it all pointed back to Bjorn. But there was more to the story. There had to be. Lars had heard the rumors before, whispers about Bjorn's violent temper and his grudges against certain men in the village. Bjorn had been a fisherman, a tough, brooding man who kept mostly to himself, but he had never been well liked. In fact, many villagers had reason to hold ill will against him, and he against them. It was an open secret that Bjorn had feuds with several of the village's more influential figures. But what bothered Lars most was what Ingrid had said. Something about the Draugr not resting until it had claimed what it was owed. He knew the Draugr were believed to be the spirits of those who had been wronged in life, rising from their graves to exact vengeance. Could that be it? Was Bjorn's disturbed grave just the beginning of a much larger reckoning? His gaze drifted to a dusty stack of old village records on the table. Papers he had been combing through since sunrise. His father's name kept coming up. Lars had never thought much about it. His father had passed years ago, a quiet, stern man who had kept to himself. But as he sifted through old documents and logs, Lars started to piece together a story he had never fully understood. It turned out his father had been part of a group, several men in the village, who had banded together to ruin Bjorn's reputation. It wasn't just business disputes or the occasional argument about fishing rights. They had spread lies, ensured Bjorn was shunned, made sure he lost his livelihood. Lars's father had played a central role in that, leading the effort to turn the village against Bjorn. And now it seemed Bjorn was back to settle the score. Lars's heart sank as he realized the implications. This wasn't just about Bjorn's restless spirit. It was about revenge. Revenge against those who had wronged him, and that included Lars by association. The blood of his father's sins was on his hands, whether he had known it or not. Lars pushed the papers aside and buried his face in his hands. It was all coming together, but that brought no relief. Instead, it only deepened his dread. He was caught in the middle of something ancient and terrible, something that was far from over. Bjorn hadn't just come for revenge on the village. He had come for Lars too, and Lars knew it wouldn't stop until the dead had their due. Lars didn't want to go back to the graveyard. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to stay away, to lock himself inside his cabin and forget about the horrors lurking in the cold soil. But he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that whatever was happening was building to something far worse than what he had already seen. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village, Lars set out toward the graveyard once more. The air was thick with a heavy mist, curling through the trees and clinging to his skin like damp fingers. The path that led to the burial grounds felt longer than usual, as though the very earth was trying to hold him back. By the time he reached the graveyard, dusk had settled in, and the place was bathed in a dull gray light. The rows of headstones, once familiar to him from years of tending the dead, now seemed foreign, almost threatening. The wind rustled the bare branches overhead, but no other sound broke the eerie silence. Even the birds had gone quiet, as if they too sensed something was wrong. Lars paused at the entrance, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't been back here since he found Bjorn's disturbed grave, since he first laid eyes on the mangled corpse. A cold sweat broke out on his brow as he scanned the rows of graves, half expecting to see something moving among the stones. For a moment, there was nothing, just the mist curling through the headstones and the oppressive silence pressing down on him. But then, in the corner of his eye, he saw it, movement. His heart lurched, and he turned toward the source of the motion, eyes straining in the dim light. At first, he thought it was just the mist playing tricks on his mind. But no, something was there, something solid. A figure, hulking and twisted, was moving between the graves, its body bloated and unnatural. Lars felt his breath catch in his throat. He couldn't make out the face, but he didn't need to. He knew what it was. The Draugr. It moved slowly, its heavy limbs dragging through the dirt, its head turning slightly as if scanning the graveyard, searching. Lars felt frozen, unable to move or even breathe, as the creature wandered closer to where he stood. Its eyes, faintly glowing in the fading light, locked onto him. Panic surged through Lars. He stumbled back, his hand fumbling for the rune Ingrid had given him, though he wasn't sure what protection it could offer against something so ancient and terrible. The Draugr took another step forward, its body creaking like old wood, and Lars knew he had to act. He turned and ran, the sound of the Draugr's slow, deliberate footsteps echoing behind him. Lars ran, his feet pounding against the earth, heart racing as though it might burst from his chest. The heavy, deliberate footsteps of the Draugr followed close behind, slow but unrelenting, each thud echoing in the darkness like a drumbeat of doom. The mist had thickened, swirling around him as he plunged into the woods, branches whipping at his face, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees seemed to loom taller as he fled, their skeletal branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out what little light remained. Every shadow took on a sinister shape, every rustling leaf a reminder that something terrible was hunting him. Lars could feel the weight of the Draugr's presence pressing down on him, as if the very air had become heavy with death. His legs burned, his chest ached, but he didn't dare stop. He glanced over his shoulder, just for a second, and his stomach lurched at what he saw. The Draugr was closer than he'd thought, its massive, decayed body lumbering through the mist, its eyes glowing faintly like embers in the dark. It moved with a slow, purposeful gait, but its presence seemed to warp the world around it. Time itself felt twisted, stretched. No matter how fast Lars ran, the creature kept closing in, step by step, as if nothing in the living world could slow its advance. A low, guttural sound escaped the Draugr's throat, a noise that sent chills racing down Lars's spine. It wasn't a growl or a roar. It was more like the sound of wind through a crypt, an ancient exhalation of pure malice. The trees around him shuddered, as if even nature recoiled from the thing that pursued him. Lars's foot caught on a root, and he stumbled, falling hard onto the ground. Pain shot through his leg as he scrambled to get up, dirt and leaves clinging to his clothes. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out all other sounds except for the relentless footsteps behind him. They were closer now, so close he could feel the cold breath of death on his skin. With a surge of adrenaline, Lars pushed himself up and limped forward, every step agonizing. He could hear the Draugr behind him, its breath rasping like dry leaves caught in the wind. The mist seemed to thicken around him, blurring his vision, but he could just make out a slope ahead, a steep hill that dropped into a gully. He had no choice. It was his only escape. Lars threw himself down the slope, tumbling head over heels through the brush. He hit the bottom hard, his body aching from the fall. Dazed, he looked up, half expecting the Draugr to be standing over him. Instead, there was only silence. The heavy footsteps had stopped, but Lars knew it was still there, waiting, watching from the mist. Lars lay at the bottom of the slope, his chest heaving as he gasped for air, his body aching from the rough tumble through the underbrush. For a moment, there was only the sound of his ragged breathing and the eerie silence that had fallen over the woods. The cold dampness of the earth seeped through his clothes, chilling him to the bone. He dared not move. Not yet. The mist swirled around him, thick and suffocating, but the heavy footsteps had ceased. Had he escaped? Was the Draugr still somewhere up there, lurking in the mist, waiting for him to make a sound? Lars strained his ears, listening for any sign of movement, any sound that might betray the creature's presence. But there was nothing. The oppressive silence felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. Slowly, Lars pushed himself to his knees, wincing as pain shot through his leg. The fall had battered him, but nothing was broken. He scanned the slope above him, his eyes searching for any sign of the hulking, twisted figure. The mist hung heavy in the air, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, just beyond the edge of his vision. His hand instinctively reached for the rune Ingrid had given him, the small carved charm that was supposed to offer protection. He clutched it tightly, hoping against hope that it would be enough to keep the Draugr at bay. But doubt gnawed at him. Could anything truly stop a creature as ancient and vengeful as the Draugr? As Lars stood, the world seemed to shift. The air grew colder, the mist thickening even more, and then, without warning, a hand clamped down on his shoulder. The grip was ice cold, the fingers impossibly strong, digging into his flesh with the force of death itself. Lars froze, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't need to turn around to know what was behind him. He could feel the weight of its presence, the coldness that seemed to drain the very life from him. The Draugr had found him. Panic surged through Lars, but his body refused to move. The grip tightened, and he felt an unnatural cold spread through his shoulder, like ice creeping into his bones. His mind screamed at him to run, to break free, but it was as if the Draugr's touch had rooted him to the spot, paralyzing him with its deadly grasp. He could hear it now, the ragged, deathly breathing behind him, the the sound of something ancient and rotting, so close he could feel its cold breath on the back of his neck. Lars swallowed hard, his throat dry. He forced his hand to move, fumbling with the rune in his pocket. But before he could pull it out, the Draugr leaned closer, and Lars felt the weight of its presence crushing him, stealing the breath from his lungs. In the next instant, everything went black. The last thing Lars heard was his own name, whispered in the dead, hollow voice of the Draugr. Lars awoke to the harsh light of dawn streaming through the trees, piercing through the fog that still lingered over the forest. His body was cold and stiff, every muscle aching as though he had been frozen in place all night. For a moment, he lay still, unsure if he was even alive. The memory of the Draugr's icy hand on his shoulder, the weight of its deathly presence, was still vivid in his mind. His heart pounded in his chest as the fear from the night before came rushing back. But when he blinked and slowly sat up, he was alone. The forest was eerily quiet. No wind stirred the trees, no birds chirped from the branches. It was as though the entire world had held its breath. Lars rubbed his shoulder where the Draugr had grabbed him, expecting to find his flesh cold and bruised. But there was no mark. His skin was untouched, though the memory of that freezing grip still clung to him. What had happened? How had he escaped? His mind raced, trying to piece together the events of the night. He had felt the Draugr's grasp, its cold, decayed breath on his neck, and then nothing. The darkness had swallowed him, and now here he was, alive. But the air still felt heavy, as if the Draugr was watching from just beyond the veil of mist, waiting. Lars stumbled to his feet, his legs shaky and weak from the ordeal. He needed to leave this place. Every instinct told him that he shouldn't linger in the woods any longer than necessary. The village was his only refuge now, though how much safety it would provide, he didn't know. He couldn't shake the feeling that the Draugr was not done with him, that this was only the beginning. The walk back to the village felt longer than usual. The mist hung thick in the air, twisting and curling between the trees like tendrils of something alive. Lars's head pounded with each step, his mind replaying the events over and over, searching for answers that wouldn't come. He clutched the rune Ingrid had given him, holding it tightly in his pocket, though now he questioned its power. If it had been meant to protect him, why had the Draugr's hand touched him at all? When he finally broke through the edge of the forest and the village came into view, a strange sense of relief washed over him. The familiar houses, the faint smell of wood smoke from the hearths, and the distant sound of life returning to its normal rhythm. It felt surreal. He had survived the night, but Lars knew better than to feel safe. The Draugr had let him go, but why? That was the question that gnawed at him as he approached his cabin. He couldn't shake the thought that the creature hadn't finished with him. And worse, that something far more sinister was yet to come. The village had always been a place of quiet, steady routine. Its people, though toughened by years of harsh winters and isolated living, carried on with their daily lives, tending to their animals and crops, fixing broken roofs and preparing for the long, cold months ahead. But after Lars returned from the woods that morning, something in the village had changed. There was an eerie stillness, a tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. And then, the first death was discovered. It was Halvor, the old blacksmith. Lars had known him his entire life. A gruff but kind man, his strength had been legendary in the village, even as age crept up on him. When they found him that morning, slumped over his anvil, his face was frozen in a grotesque expression of terror. His eyes were wide open, staring into nothing, and his skin was as pale as freshly fallen snow. The blacksmith's apprentice, the one who had found the body, claimed that there were no signs of a struggle, no indication that Halvor had been attacked. But something had drained the life from him. The apprentice swore that the air in the blacksmith's shop had been thick with the smell of rot, a stench so overpowering that he'd had to step outside to catch his breath. When Lars heard this, the knot of dread in his stomach tightened. The village buzzed with whispers that day. People tried to make sense of Halvor's sudden death, though no one dared speak the words that sat on the edge of everyone's minds. Draugr. The old stories, once dismissed as superstition, seemed to loom over the village like a shadow, too frightening to be acknowledged outright, but too close to ignore. But Halvor's death wasn't the only one. By mid-afternoon, the news had spread that another villager, a farmer named Thora, had been found dead in her barn. Like Halvor, her face was frozen in terror, her body cold and stiff. Her animals had scattered, as if something had frightened them to madness. Her husband, pale with shock, claimed to have heard strange noises in the night, scratching like claws on wood, and a heavy wheezing breath just outside the window. But when he had looked, there had been nothing. The panic in the village grew. People began to lock their doors earlier, huddling inside their homes as soon as the sun dipped behind the mountains. No one lingered in the streets anymore, and every gust of wind that rattled the windows made them jump. Lars couldn't shake the feeling that the deaths were connected to Bjorn's grave, to the Draugr. He tried to stay out of sight, avoiding the suspicious glances from the villagers, who now seemed to look at him with thinly veiled distrust. After all, he had been the one to find Bjorn's disturbed grave. He had been the one to set off this chain of events. And now, as the deaths began to mount, Lars feared that whatever was rising from the graveyard was just getting started. Lars sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the small carved rune in his hand. It was supposed to protect him. That's what Ingrid had said. Keep it with you, and it will ward off the Draugr. But now, he wasn't so sure. He'd felt the Draugr's icy grip the night before, had heard its ragged breath, had nearly been dragged into whatever nightmare lay beyond the mist. And here he was, alive, but the rune had done nothing to stop the Draugr from finding him. He rubbed his thumb over the worn, jagged edges of the rune, its surface smooth from years of use. The symbol etched into it, a twisting, ancient design, seemed duller than it had been when Ingrid first handed it to him. The faint glow he had noticed before was gone. Lars didn't know whether it was his imagination or something real, but the rune no longer felt powerful, if it had ever truly held any power at all. The deaths in the village weighed heavily on him. Halvor, Thora, and others whispered about, but not yet confirmed. Each of them had passed under strange circumstances, their faces twisted in terror, and each time the smell of rot had clung to the air around their bodies, a grim sign that the Draugr had been near. Lars feared that the creature's vengeance was far from over, and he was at the center of it all. He looked out the small window beside his bed. The day was already darkening, the sun slipping behind thick clouds, casting long shadows across the village. A storm was coming. The wind howled through the trees, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the growing dread in his heart. He gripped the rune tighter, as if holding it could restore the power it once promised. Kjetil, his faithful dog, lay by the hearth, lifting his head occasionally to whine at the shifting shadows outside. Even the animals sensed something was wrong. The air in the cabin was thick, suffocating, as if the very walls were pressing in on him. Lars stood up abruptly, pacing the small space. He couldn't sit here and wait for the Draugr to find him again. He needed answers. Ingrid had been his only guide, but she had warned him that the Draugr wouldn't stop until it had claimed its due. And the rune? Maybe it had worked for a time. Maybe it had staved off the worst of the Draugr's wrath, but it was failing now. He could feel it. As he paced, Lars kept glancing at the rune, willing it to glow again, to pulse with the protection he so desperately needed. But the rune remained dull, lifeless. A sickening feeling of helplessness crept over him. Was the Draugr growing stronger? Was its curse overwhelming the old magic that had once held it back? Lars didn't know, but one thing was clear. The rune wasn't going to save him this time. Outside, the wind howled louder, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, creeping toward his door. Lars sat by the dim glow of his lantern, the light flickering weakly as the wind howled outside his cabin. The rune lay on the table in front of him, now feeling more like a relic of a lost hope than a tool of protection. But it wasn't just the failing rune that gnawed at him. It was the past, his past, and more importantly, his father's. The discovery of Bjorn's grave, the unsettling deaths, the Draugr. It all circled back to something deeper. Something that had been buried in the dark corners of the village's history. Lars had been sifting through old records for days, trying to understand what had led to this. His father's name kept appearing, tied to incidents Lars had been too young to remember fully. But now, as the pieces fell into place, a picture began to emerge. A dark and shameful one. His father, along with a few other prominent men in the village, had been responsible for ruining Bjorn's life. It wasn't just gossip or petty squabbles over fishing rights. They had systematically dismantled Bjorn's reputation, casting him out as an outsider, a pariah. Bjorn's livelihood, his very identity, had been taken from him. And why? Out of jealousy, out of greed. His father had been one of the ringleaders, manipulating the villagers with lies and deceit to get what he wanted. Lars had always admired his father for being a hard, honest man, someone who commanded respect. But now, the truth was surfacing like a rotting corpse in the swamp, too ugly to ignore. Bjorn had died with bitterness in his heart, his rage left unresolved. And that unresolved fury was what fueled the Draugr, what brought Bjorn back from the dead to exact revenge on the living. It was as if Lars could feel the weight of his father's sins pressing down on him. Even though he hadn't been a part of it, hadn't known the full extent of what had happened, he still bore the guilt. He was his father's son, and in the eyes of the Draugr, that made him guilty by association. The more he dug into the past, the more Lars realized how deeply his father's betrayal ran. It wasn't just Bjorn's livelihood that had been destroyed. His family had been affected too. His wife had left him, his children scattered, and Bjorn had been left to wither in isolation until his eventual death. No wonder the Draugr had risen with such vengeance. No wonder the deaths had started. Lars's hand trembled as he traced the carved edges of the rune again, though he knew it was a futile gesture. The Draugr wasn't just coming for the men who had wronged him, it was coming for their bloodlines, their legacies. And Lars, through no fault of his own, had inherited the sins of his father. Outside, the wind shifted, and for a brief moment, Lars thought he heard a low, guttural sound. almost like a voice, carried on the breeze. His blood ran cold. The Draugr wasn't finished yet. Lars knew he couldn't face the Draugr alone. The rune, once thought to be his lifeline, had faded in power, and the deaths were mounting. The village was terrified, gripped by a fear they couldn't name but felt all around them. His father's sins had come back to haunt the living, and now Lars was left to pick up the pieces. The only person who might help him now was Ingrid, the old woman who had warned him from the start, the one who knew the ancient ways. She'd given him the rune, but it hadn't been enough. Desperate, Lars trekked back through the woods toward Ingrid's cabin, the wind biting at his face, the sky darkening as a storm brewed overhead. The trees loomed large and threatening, their branches twisting together like fingers closing in around him. But Lars pressed on, knowing he had no other choice. He had to find Ingrid. She was the only one who might know how to stop the Draugr before more people died. When he reached her cabin, he was greeted by silence. The door was ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. His stomach churned with dread as he stepped inside. The hearth was cold, and the familiar scent of herbs and smoke that usually filled the air was gone. The cabin felt empty, lifeless. "Ingrid?" Lars called, his voice tight with fear. He moved deeper into the small space, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of her. That's when he saw her. Ingrid, lying motionless on the floor near the fire pit. She looked so small, so fragile, her face pale, her body still. Lars rushed to her side, dropping to his knees. "Ingrid," he shouted, shaking her gently. But she didn't stir. He checked her pulse, his fingers trembling, but there was nothing. Her skin was cold, her body stiff. She was gone. A wave of despair washed over him. Ingrid had been his last hope. She had known the old ways, the rituals that might have stopped the Draugr. But now she was dead, and with her, the knowledge he needed to end the curse. He looked around the cabin, desperate for something, anything, that might offer a clue. That's when he noticed a small folded piece of parchment on the table, scrawled in Ingrid's shaky handwriting. Lars unfolded the note, his heart pounding. The message was short but chilling. The Draugr cannot be stopped by a rune alone. A soul must be offered. Only sacrifice will quell the dead's rage. The Draugr will demand its due. Be ready. His blood ran cold as the meaning of the words sank in. Ingrid hadn't just been warning him. She had known what needed to be done. She had sacrificed herself to buy him more time, to delay the Draugr's vengeance. Tears welled in Lars's eyes as he realized the magnitude of her sacrifice. She had given her life to protect the village, but her note made one thing clear. The Draugr's rage was not sated. It was still coming, and Lars would have to decide whose soul would be offered next. After the confrontation with the Draugr, the quiet of Lars's cabin was a welcome reprieve from the chaos of the graveyard. Yet, even in the stillness, he couldn't escape the memories of that night. Each time he closed his eyes, the visions came rushing back. Flashes of the Draugr, the cold grip of its hand, the tormented faces of the dead surrounding him. Sleep became a tormenting cycle of restless nights and haunting dreams. The first few nights after the battle, Lars managed to find some solace. Exhausted from the ordeal, he fell into a deep sleep. But as the days passed, the nightmares returned with a vengeance. Each night, the scenes grew more vivid and terrifying, blurring the line between reality and his dreams. He found himself back in the graveyard, watching helplessly as the Draugr rose from its grave, eyes glowing with a sinister light. The whispers of the dead filled his ears, their voices a chilling cacophony, demanding justice. They were angry and lost, their spirits restless and seeking retribution. Lars could see their skeletal forms moving through the fog, their faces twisted in rage and despair. No matter how hard he tried to escape, he was always drawn back into their midst, feeling their cold breath and hearing their mournful cries. Each time he awoke, drenched in sweat and gasping for breath, he felt the weight of their presence lingering in the air around him. It was as if they were still there, watching, waiting for something he couldn't understand. The nights grew longer, and Lars became a prisoner of his own mind. He tried everything to shake the nightmares. He read every book he could find on sleep and dreams, searching for remedies and explanations. He drank herbal teas, lit calming candles, and even attempted to meditate, but nothing worked. The dreams persisted, relentless and tormenting, each night more harrowing than the last. During the day, Lars felt the fatigue of his sleepless nights seeping into his bones. The villagers had noticed his haggard appearance and whispered among themselves, concern etched on their faces. They were still grappling with their own fears, but Lars could feel their gaze weighing heavily upon him. They were grateful for his bravery, but he felt like a ghost among them, haunted by the past, unable to shake the darkness that clung to him. One night, as he lay in bed, heart racing and mind spiraling, a new dream emerged. This time he was standing in front of a massive door, covered in ancient runes that pulsed with an eerie light. The whispers of the dead echoed around him, urging him to open the door. He felt an overwhelming compulsion, a mix of fear and intrigue. "Open it, Lars," they urged. "You must confront the truth." He awoke with a start, the echo of their words lingering in his mind. There was something in that dream, something he needed to understand. The nightmares had intensified, but perhaps they were also guiding him to the answers he sought. And with that realization came a flicker of hope, a desire to confront whatever lay behind that door in his dreams. As the nights grew darker and the nightmares intensified, so too did the tension in the village. The deaths that had plagued the community weighed heavily on the minds of the villagers, and whispers of blame began to surface. It was no longer just the haunting presence of the Draugr that troubled Lars. Now the villagers' fear had turned into suspicion, and suspicion into accusation. Lars had always been an integral part of the village, respected as the undertaker, the one who prepared the dead for their final rest. But after the recent events, the deaths of Halvor, Thora, and others, the atmosphere shifted. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors upon him, their gazes filled with a mix of curiosity and distrust. It was as if he had become a pariah, marked by the sins of his father and the ghosts of the past. Rumors began to circulate, each more unfounded than the last. Some said that Lars had been the one to disturb Bjorn's grave, that he had called forth the Draugr with his meddling. Others whispered that he had made a pact with the undead, using dark magic to summon them for his own gain. With every passing day, the murmurs grew louder, and Lars could no longer ignore the way people turned their backs as he approached. At the weekly market, he noticed the villagers clustering together, their voices low as he passed. Children were told to stay away from him, and adults exchanged worried glances as he approached the stalls. Lars felt the weight of their judgment, the chill of their rejection. The sense of isolation seeped into his bones, and he began to understand that his relationship with the village was forever changed. One evening, he He gathered the courage to confront Stig, the wiry man who had rallied the villagers against the Draugr. Stig stood near the well, arms crossed, a look of disdain etched on his face as Lars approached. "We need to talk," Lars said, trying to keep his voice steady. Stig's eyes narrowed. "What is there to talk about? We know what you've done. Your meddling has brought death upon us." "Brought death?" Lars exclaimed, disbelief flooding through him. "I'm the one who faced the Draugr. I was trying to save us. By opening graves and stirring up spirits? You're not a hero, Lars. You're a fool," Stig retorted, his voice rising. The small crowd around them began to murmur, their eyes shifting between Lars and Stig. The air thickened with tension. Lars felt a wave of anger rise within him. "You don't understand. The Draugr was unleashed long before I arrived. I was trying to protect you all. Protect us? Or protect yourself?" Stig shot back, his tone biting. "You're just a scapegoat trying to shift blame. We're not interested in your excuses." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and Lars realized that the tide had turned against him. He was now the embodiment of their fear, a figure they could point to when the darkness crept too close. Feeling the weight of their stares, Lars stepped back, the coldness of rejection piercing his heart. The village he had known and loved felt like a stranger now. He turned away, feeling lost and alone. He had fought the Draugr, but now he was battling something even more insidious, the fear that had woven itself into the very fabric of his community. The village had turned on him, and in their fear, they had chosen to blame the very person who had tried to save them. Lars felt the weight of despair settle over him like a thick fog as he retreated from the village square. The accusations had cut deeper than any wound he had received in his confrontation with the Draugr. He was now viewed as a pariah, a source of fear and suspicion. Determined to prove his innocence and restore his place in the community, he decided he needed to confront the source of the village's terror once and for all. The graveyard. Under the cover of darkness, Lars made his way back to the graveyard, where the memories of his previous encounters with the Draugr lingered like ghosts. The wind howled through the trees, and the moon cast eerie shadows across the headstones. As he approached, he could feel the chill in the air, a prelude to the malevolence that seemed to seep from the very ground. He had come prepared this time, equipped with the remnants of the protective rune Ingrid had given him, and a small torch to light the way. The flickering flame danced wildly in the night, casting long shadows that twisted and swayed like the spirits of the dead. Lars hesitated for a moment at the entrance, steeling himself against the fear that gnawed at him. As he stepped into the graveyard, a sense of foreboding washed over him. The place felt alive, the air thick with an unsettling energy. Suddenly a sound shattered the silence, a rustling from the shadows. Lars turned quickly, his heart pounding. Was it the Draugr, or something worse? "Lars, what are you doing here?" a voice shouted from the darkness. It was Stig, accompanied by a group of villagers armed with pitchforks and torches. Their faces were lit by the flames, but their expressions were grim, filled with anger and fear. "I'm here to end this," Lars replied, raising the torch defiantly. "We need to confront the Draugr before more lives are lost." Stig stepped forward, his expression hardening. "You think you can fix this? You're the one who stirred the spirits. We came to put an end to you." The villagers moved closer, their torches flickering ominously. Lars realized with dread that they believed he was the source of their troubles. They saw him as a threat, not a savior. He felt a mix of anger and despair surge within him. "You don't understand," Lars shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. "I'm trying to help. The Draugr will come for all of you if we don't act now." But the villagers were unmoved, their resolve hardened by fear and grief. In a flash, the crowd surged forward, pitchforks raised, ready to silence the one they believed had brought darkness upon them. Lars stumbled backward, adrenaline surging through him as he realized he was cornered. The very people he had fought to protect were now turning against him. The line between friend and foe blurred in the dim light of the graveyard. As the villagers advanced, their faces contorted with rage. A chilling howl echoed through the night, reverberating off the headstones. The Draugr was coming, and it would arrive in the midst of chaos. Time was running out, and Lars knew he had to act quickly, not just to save himself, but to save the village from the wrath of the undead. The atmosphere in the graveyard grew tense as Lars faced the advancing villagers, their faces twisted with rage and fear. Just as he opened his mouth to plead for reason, a bone-chilling howl pierced the air, echoing through the trees. The sound reverberated in his chest, sending shivers down his spine. It was a warning, a harbinger of the doom that was approaching. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The air thickened, and the mist began to swirl around the grave markers. Shadows twisted and coiled like smoke, coalescing into forms that emerged from the darkness. One by one, the dead rose from their graves, pale and twisted, their eyes glowing with a sickly light. The Draugr had awakened an army. Lars felt a wave of horror wash over him as he realized the magnitude of what was unfolding. The villagers, sensing the presence of the undead, froze in shock, their anger giving way to primal fear. The once familiar graves were now hosted of vengeful spirits, each one seeking retribution for the wrongs done to them in life. "Run!" Lars shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. "We need to get out of here." But the villagers were rooted in place, their eyes wide as they watched the Draugr and their army slowly advance. The figures moved with a deliberate slowness, their limbs stiff and unnatural, yet their presence was terrifying. Each step they took seemed to sap the warmth from the air, leaving only an overwhelming chill in their wake. The lead Draugr, its face barely recognizable as human, turned its hollow gaze toward Lars, its lips curling into a grotesque imitation of a smile. The malevolence radiating from it was palpable, an energy that threatened to crush the living. It raised a bony hand, pointing directly at Lars, as if accusing him of summoning them back from the grave. Stig finally found his voice, breaking the stunned silence. "We need to fight. We can't let them take us." His words were a rallying cry, but they were tinged with panic. The villagers picked up their pitchforks and torches, steeling themselves to confront the approaching horror. But Lars knew instinctively that no mere weapon would stop the Draugr. "We can't fight them," he shouted desperately. "They're already dead. We need to find a way to banish them, to put them to rest." But before he could formulate a plan, the Draugr surged forward, and the air filled with their low, mournful wails. The once calm graveyard erupted into chaos as the villagers screamed and began to scatter. Lars was caught in the midst of it all, panic rising in his chest. He had to think quickly. The Draugr were drawn to the fear and chaos, and if they could harness that energy, the entire village would be lost. He glanced back at the rune, still clutched in his hand, its power flickering like the dying flame of his torch. With the village caught between despair and terror, He realized the only way to save them was to confront the Draugr's army head-on, before it was too late. Lars stood frozen as the Draugr surged toward him, and the panicked villagers, the air thick with the smell of decay and despair. Time seemed to slow, the world around him blurring, as the chilling wails of the undead echoed in his ears. The villagers were scattering, their faces pale with fear, some falling to the ground as the dead advanced, their skeletal forms moving with a grotesque determination. The terror in the air was palpable, and Lars knew he had to act fast. In that moment of sheer panic, an idea struck him. The ancient stories spoke of using fire to banish the restless dead, a way to purify their spirits and send them back to their graves. But he needed a circle, a protective barrier that would keep the Draugr at bay while he summoned the flames. "Gather around," he shouted, trying to make himself heard over the chaos. "We need to form a circle. Trust me, we can protect ourselves." Stig and a few other villagers hesitated, confusion etched on their faces as the Draugr closed in. But the fear in Lars's voice seemed to penetrate their panic, and slowly they began to regroup around him, weapons raised, forming a rough circle. The Draugr paused at the edge of the gathering, their glowing eyes fixated on the living, their hollow forms silhouetted against the dim light. "Get the torches," Lars urged. "We need to light them now." Some villagers scrambled to gather their torches, while others fought to stay close to the growing circle. Lars felt the chill of the Draugr's presence creeping closer, the shadows twisting in on themselves as if alive, reaching for him with skeletal hands. Finally, as the villagers lit their torches, flames flickered to life, casting a warm glow against the encroaching darkness. Lars quickly stepped into the center of the circle, raising his own torch high. "This is our only chance. Light the perimeter." As the flames danced, a barrier formed around them, the heat pushing back against the cold. The Draugr hesitated, their expressions shifting from hunger to confusion as the flames crackled and roared. Lars felt a surge of hope, but he knew it wouldn't hold for long. The Draugr were not just mindless spirits. They were driven by rage and vengeance. With a fierce determination, Lars began to chant the ancient words he had learned from Ingrid, his voice steady amidst the rising chaos. "By fire and spirit I command you, return to the earth, find your peace." The Draugr reacted, their forms shifting uneasily as the flames grew brighter. Lars could feel the energy in the air shift, a strange force building as the dead hesitated, seemingly caught between their desire for vengeance and the purifying flames. But just as the first flickers of hope began to spark in the villagers' eyes, a sudden gust of wind swept through the graveyard, extinguishing several torches in an instant. Panic surged through the crowd, and the circle began to break. The Draugr advanced, emboldened by the chaos, their hollow cries echoing in the darkness. Lars felt the terror rise within him again. This was it, the final stand. With the circle beginning to falter and the Draugr surging forward, he had to hold on, for himself and for the village. But as the flames sputtered and the shadows loomed, he wondered if they could survive the oncoming tide of the undead. The battle was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. The night air crackled with tension as Lars stood at the center of the flickering circle of fire, heart racing as the Draugr advanced. The villagers around him clutched their torches, fear etched on their faces, but their determination began to waver as the flames sputtered in the chilling wind. The moment the torches dimmed, the Draugr lunged forward. their skeletal forms closing in on the circle. "Hold the line," Lars shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. He felt the energy of the rune pulsing in his pocket, urging him to take action. "Don't let them break through." The flames flickered wildly, the heat pulsating in waves as the Draugr drew nearer. Each step they took felt like a death knell, the ground vibrating with the echoes of their hollow footfalls. The villagers rallied, raising their torches higher, but the flames were no match for the cold fear that gripped them. With a swift motion, Lars pulled the rune from his pocket and held it aloft, its glow brightening as he focused his will. "By fire and spirit, I command you," he cried, his voice steady and resolute. "Return to the earth." The Draugr hesitated, their glowing eyes narrowing as they felt the power of the rune. But the moment was fleeting. With a surge of energy, they lunged forward, clawed hands reaching for the living. Lars felt a rush of adrenaline surge through him as he stepped closer to the edge of the circle. "We can't let them through." He took a deep breath, channeling his fear into strength. He turned to the villagers, their faces reflecting both hope and terror. "We need to ignite the flames again." Just then, a chilling howl pierced the night, reverberating through the graveyard. The Draugr responded with a surge of energy, their forms coalescing into a dark wave that threatened to engulf the circle. The flames flickered, casting long shadows that danced erratically. Lars lunged forward, raising the rune high, feeling its warmth envelop him. "Light, burn bright," he shouted, throwing his body into the ritual he had seen Ingrid perform. "Ignite with the power of the past." With those words, a brilliant flash erupted from the rune, expanding outward and igniting the air with a fierce light. The fire roared to life, shooting up in a brilliant blaze, pushing back against the encroaching darkness. The Draugr recoiled, momentarily stunned, their forms wavering in the heat. "Now, push them back," Lars commanded, adrenaline coursing through him. The villagers rallied, their torches bursting back to life, flames leaping higher as they pressed forward, driving the Draugr away from their circle. The battle raged as the villagers fought with newfound courage, torches swinging and flames leaping, illuminating the night. Each swing became a defiance against the darkness, a fight for survival. The Draugr screeched, their anguished cries filling the air, but Lars felt the tide beginning to turn. With each flicker of flame, he could see the resolve in the villagers' eyes growing stronger. They were fighting not just for their lives, but for the honor of those who had been wronged. As the flames flickered and surged, Lars knew they could win this battle, but it would come at a cost. They had to endure, for the Draugr would not rest until their vengeance was fulfilled. The battle in the graveyard had ignited a fierce determination within Lars and the villagers, but it had also taken its toll. The flames flickered against the twilight sky, casting a warm glow on the faces of the weary but resolute villagers. They had fought bravely, pushing back against the Draugr. But Lars knew this was only a temporary victory. The darkness still lingered, and the price of their survival weighed heavily on his heart. He needed guidance, and he realized that the only person who could provide it was Ingrid. With the embers still glowing and the remnants of the Draugr fading into the night, Lars felt an urgent pull to return to Ingrid's cabin deep in the woods. He had dismissed her warnings before, but now, more than ever, he understood the importance of her wisdom. She had been their last line of defense against the horrors that lurked in the shadows, and he owed it to her memory to seek her knowledge once more. As Lars made his way through the darkening woods, the trees seemed to whisper around him, their branches twisting like fingers in the night. The earlier adrenaline from the battle faded, replaced by an unsettling unease. Every rustle in the underbrush made him jump. Every shadow felt like a reminder of the horrors he had faced. But he pressed on, his resolve stronger than his fear. When he finally reached Ingrid's cabin, the familiar sight brought both relief and sorrow. The door hung slightly ajar, a sign that no one had been there for some time. Inside, the cabin was dark, and the air was heavy with the scent of earth and herbs, mingling with the bittersweet aroma of loss. Lars stepped inside, his heart heavy as he glanced around, searching for any sign of Ingrid. The hearth lay cold, and the shelves were lined with jars of dried herbs, remnants of her craft. The memories of her gentle presence flooded back. Her warm smile, her words of wisdom, the stories she had shared about the old ways. He felt a pang of regret for not having listened more closely, for not fully appreciating her teachings while she was alive. As he moved further into the cabin, he spotted the small table where she had often worked, surrounded by ancient texts and scrolls. A single piece of parchment lay there, slightly crumpled, but still legible. It was a message she had written, filled with notes and symbols he had seen her use in her rituals. Hope flickered in his chest. He picked up the parchment, his fingers brushing over her handwriting. "The power of the past can guide the living," it read. "When darkness encroaches, remember, unity brings strength and knowledge is the light." Lars felt a surge of determination. He would honor Ingrid's legacy, share her teachings with the villagers, and arm them with the knowledge they needed to combat the darkness that still lingered. As he stood in the cabin, the weight of her absence felt lighter, replaced by a sense of purpose. He would not let her sacrifice be in vain. The battle was not over, and he would face whatever lay ahead with the strength of the past guiding him. With newfound determination, Lars left Ingrid's cabin, clutching the parchment that contained her words of wisdom. He knew the village needed to unite against the lingering darkness, and he had to rally them for what would be the final confrontation with the Draugr. It was now or never. He could not allow fear to consume him or his community. As he made his way back through the woods, the night air was heavy with tension. The atmosphere crackled, as if the very essence of the forest was holding its breath in anticipation. Each step felt like a march toward destiny, the shadows shifting as if they too were aware of the impending confrontation. Lars's heart raced, not just from fear, but from a growing sense of purpose. Reaching the village, he found the villagers still recovering from the chaos of the earlier battle. Their faces were etched with exhaustion, but Lars could see glimmers of resolve behind their eyes. He climbed onto a crate in the village square, calling for their attention. The murmurs quieted as they turned to face him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "We cannot let the Draugr take our homes, our lives," Lars shouted, raising the parchment high above his head. "Ingrid's teachings have shown me the way forward. We must unite, gather our strength, and confront the Draugr once and for all." A few villagers exchanged doubtful glances, but Stig stepped forward, his face drawn but resolute. "What do we need to do, Lars? We will create a circle of protection, using fire as our shield," Lars explained, his voice steadying as he spoke. "We need to gather as many torches as we can and form a barrier around the graves. If we stand together, we can draw on the power of our unity and push back the darkness." The crowd began to murmur in agreement, their fear slowly transforming into a collective strength. One by one, they stepped forward to grab torches, their faces set with determination. Lars felt a surge of hope. Together, they could reclaim their village. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, the villagers gathered at the graveyard, forming a protective circle around the disturbed graves. The air was charged with anticipation, the weight of their fear tempered by the flickering flames of their torches. Lars stood at the front, the rune still clutched tightly in his hand, feeling its energy pulse in time with his heartbeat. Suddenly, the ground began to tremble, and a cold wind whipped through the graveyard. The Draugr were coming, drawn by the scent of fear. Lars could feel the familiar chill creep into the air, the haunting cries of the undead echoing through the night. "Hold your ground," Lars shouted. As the first Draugr emerged from the shadows, its skeletal form illuminated by the flickering flames. The villagers tightened their grips on their torches, hearts racing as they faced the approaching horde. But Lars stood tall, raising the rune high. "We will not let fear rule us. We will protect our home." As the Draugr advanced, the villagers joined him in chanting the ancient words from Ingrid's teachings, their voices rising in unison. The flames blazed higher, fueled by their determination, casting a fierce light against the encroaching darkness. This time they would not falter. They would confront the Draugr together, united in purpose and spirit, ready to reclaim their future. As the Draugr surged toward them, their hollow eyes gleaming with rage, Lars felt the weight of their collective wrath pressing against the circle of fire. The villagers stood shoulder to shoulder, clutching their torches, but Lars knew that mere fire wouldn't be enough to vanquish the vengeful spirits that sought retribution. He could see the fear in their eyes, but also a flicker of resolve. They were prepared to fight, yet he sensed that the true battle would require a sacrifice greater than anything they had faced before. "Listen to me," Lars shouted over the howling wind, desperation coloring his voice. "To truly banish the Draugr, we must offer something precious. We must break the cycle of vengeance that has gripped this land." Stig turned to him, confusion evident on his face. "What do you mean? What can we possibly offer?" Lars swallowed hard, his throat dry. Ingrid spoke of a soul that must be offered to quell their anger. It doesn't have to be another life. It can be a sacrifice of intent, a willingness to confront the darkness within ourselves. He took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "I will do it. I will offer myself." Gasps echoed through the crowd, disbelief mingled with horror. "No, Lars," a woman cried, her eyes wide with fear. "We can't let you do this." "This is not just about me," he replied firmly, meeting their gazes. "This is about all of us. If I can face the Draugr's wrath, it might give you the strength to push them back. We need to end this cycle of pain for good." The villagers looked at one another, uncertainty rippling through the group. But Lars could see the flicker of understanding in their eyes. They had all lost something to the Draugr's curse. This was their chance to reclaim their lives, their future. As the Draugr closed in, the air thick with tension, Lars stepped forward, holding the rune high above his head. The villagers began to chant the ancient words they had learned from Ingrid, their voices rising in a crescendo. The flames flickered but held strong, a barrier against the encroaching darkness. "Take me," Lars shouted, the heat of the flames warming his skin. "Let my sacrifice cleanse this village. I offer my spirit to restore the balance." The Draugr hesitated, the anger in their hollow eyes wavering for the briefest moment. Lars could feel their confusion, the flicker of recognition in their ethereal forms. He knew this was a gamble, a chance that could either save them or doom them all. With a final, determined breath, he stepped toward the oncoming tide of the undead, the rune pulsing with energy in his hand. I will not let fear rule us any longer. In that moment, Lars understood that sacrifice was not merely about loss. It was about embracing hope and the possibility of a brighter future. He was ready to face whatever lay ahead, even if it meant stepping into the unknown, trusting that his sacrifice would pave the way for the living to reclaim their lives from the grip of the Draugr. As Lars stepped forward, a surge of energy coursed through him, fueled by the chanting villagers and the warmth of the torches surrounding him. The flames flickered wildly, illuminating the graveyard with an otherworldly glow that cast long shadows over the headstones. The Draugr, sensing his defiance, hesitated momentarily, their hollow forms writhing as if caught between their desire for vengeance and the power of the light. Lars raised the rune high above his head, its surface shimmering in the firelight. "By fire and spirit I command you," he shouted, his voice steady and unwavering. "Let this flame cleanse the darkness that has plagued us." The villagers echoed his words, their voices growing louder, blending into a single powerful chorus. The heat from the torches intensified, flames licking higher as if responding to their collective resolve. With each chant, the glow of the rune brightened, and the energy pulsing within Lars seemed to synchronize with the heartbeat of the earth itself. But the Draugr were not easily deterred. They surged forward, a tide of rotting flesh and anger, their mournful cries filling the air with a chilling resonance. Lars felt the coldness seep into his bones, but he pressed on, focusing on the flickering flames. He needed to harness their power to push back the encroaching darkness. "Form a tighter circle," he shouted to the villagers, his heart racing. "Keep the flames strong." With renewed determination, the villagers tightened their formation, their torches raised high, illuminating the night. Lars felt a deep connection with them. They were no longer just frightened individuals, but a united front against the undead. The flames roared to life, a fierce barrier against the Draugr's advance. The Draugr paused at the edge of the firelight, their eyes flickering with confusion. For a brief moment, Lars felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps they could truly push back the darkness. But then, a powerful gust of wind howled through the graveyard, extinguishing a few of the torches and sending a shudder of fear through the villagers. "Stay strong," Lars cried, his voice rising above the chaos. "Don't let them break our spirit." The villagers rallied, reigniting the fallen torches with frenzied determination. Lars concentrated on the rune, willing its energy to flow through him, igniting the flames anew. He could feel the power building within him, a force that resonated with the very essence of the land. As the Draugr advanced once more, the flames surged higher, enveloping them in a brilliant light. The undead shrieked, their forms twisting and writhing in the heat. Lars could sense the tide beginning to turn. The energy of the villagers' unity was driving the Draugr back. "Together," he shouted, feeling the weight of their shared resolve, "we will banish the darkness." In that moment, the flames erupted into a brilliant conflagration, lighting up the graveyard as if the sun had risen in the middle of the night. The Draugr screamed, their forms dissolving into ashes as the heat enveloped them. Lars knew they were on the verge of victory. But the battle was far from over. With the flames rising, he had one chance to reclaim their village and set the lost souls free. The dawn broke over the graveyard, casting a soft, golden light on the smoldering remnants of the Draugr. As the flames dwindled to embers, Lars felt the weight of exhaustion settle in his bones, but relief washed over him like a warm tide. The battle had been fierce, but they had triumphed. The village, once gripped by fear, was now free from the clutches of the undead. As he stepped away from the charred remains of the Draugr, Lars turned to face the villagers. They were weary but alive, their faces reflecting a mix of disbelief and newfound hope. The tension that had filled the air for so long had dissipated, replaced by an overwhelming sense of camaraderie and relief. Stig approached Lars, a hesitant smile breaking across his face. "You did it, Lars. We did it together." The words seemed to lift the spirits of those around them, and a wave of quiet cheers rose from the crowd. Lars nodded, still catching his breath. "We fought for each other. This victory belongs to all of us." The realization of their unity filled him with pride. They had faced the darkness together and emerged stronger. As the villagers gathered around him, they shared stories of their bravery and the sacrifices they had made. They spoke of the flames that had purged the graveyard, igniting a light that had dispelled their fears. The bond they shared in that moment was palpable, a collective strength forged in the fires of adversity. In the days that followed, the village slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but the scars of the past lingered. The graves of Halvor, Thora, and Ingrid stood as solemn reminders of what they had endured. Yet the villagers honored them, telling stories of their lives, celebrating their contributions to the community. Lars helped organize a memorial where flowers were laid at each grave, a tribute to those who had fallen. With each passing day, the village began to flourish again. The fields were tended, laughter returned to the marketplace, and the sounds of children playing filled the air once more. The oppressive darkness that had loomed over them had been lifted. But Lars understood that the memories of their struggle would forever be etched in their hearts. As the sun set one evening, Lars found himself standing at the edge of the village, watching the people he loved return to their routines. He felt a sense of peace, a calm that had eluded him for so long. But he also felt a deep responsibility, a commitment to ensure that the lessons learned from their ordeal were never forgotten. Lars gathered the villagers around a bonfire that night, the flames dancing brightly against the darkening sky. He shared Ingrid's teachings, the stories of the past, and the importance of honoring their connection to the land and the spirits that dwelled within it. Together, they forged a pact to protect their village, to embrace the old ways while moving forward with hope. The village had returned to normal, but it was a new normal, one imbued with resilience, strength, and a profound understanding of the balance between light and darkness. They had faced their fears, and in doing so had emerged stronger, united by the bonds of community and the memory of those they had lost. As the village returned to its vibrant self, Lars felt an ache deep within him, a reminder of those they had lost during the turmoil. Though the people laughed and celebrated the newfound peace, he could not shake the weight of grief that settled over him like a heavy cloak. One grave in particular called to him, the unmarked grave of Ingrid, the wise woman whose teachings had saved them all. Determined to honor her memory, Lars made his way to the graveyard. The familiar path still etched in his mind, The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground. He found himself hesitating at the entrance, a mixture of sorrow and resolve flooding through him. The village had lost so much, and Ingrid's sacrifice felt like an unfinished chapter in their story. When he reached her grave, Lars knelt down, the cool earth still fresh and undisturbed. The absence of a marker had haunted him since the battle. He couldn't let her memory fade into obscurity. He took a moment to gather his thoughts, recalling the lessons she had imparted, the importance of the old ways, the connection to the land, and the spirits that dwelled within it. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner," he whispered, placing a gentle hand on the earth. "You deserve so much more than this. You saved us, and now it's my turn to ensure your legacy lives on." With renewed determination, Lars rose to his feet and scanned the surrounding area for materials. He wanted to create a fitting tribute, something that would honor Ingrid's wisdom and the sacrifice she had made. He spotted some sturdy stones nearby, remnants of the old wall that had once surrounded the graveyard. Each stone carried a history of its own, a story that intertwined with those of the villagers. He set to work, arranging the stones in a circular pattern, creating a small but distinct border around the grave. As he worked, he envisioned how Ingrid would have approached the task with grace and care. With each stone he laid, he recounted the tales she had shared, her laughter echoing in his mind. Once he had completed the circle, he carefully picked a handful of wildflowers that bloomed nearby, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the somber earth. He placed them gently within the circle, a burst of life amidst the stillness of the graveyard. "There," he said, stepping back to admire his work. "You are remembered now, Ingrid. You are a part of this village, and we will honor your teachings. We will carry on your legacy." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the graveyard, Lars felt a sense of peace wash over him. The unmarked grave was no longer just a mound of earth. It was a symbol of resilience, a reminder of the strength they had found in their darkest hour. With this tribute, he knew that Ingrid's spirit would continue to guide them, lighting their path as they moved forward into a brighter future. In the weeks following the battle with the Draugr, the village buzzed with renewed energy and life. Laughter filled the streets, and the aroma of fresh bread wafted through the air, mingling with the scent of blooming flowers. But amidst this resurgence of normalcy, a new legend began to take root. A tale of bravery, sacrifice, and the mystical powers that had saved them from the darkness. The villagers gathered around the bonfire each evening, eager to share stories of that fateful night. They spoke of Lars, the young undertaker who had stood bravely against the Draugr, wielding the power of the ancient rune, and rallying them to form a circle of fire that drove back the undead. As the stories were retold, the details became grander, the emotions more intense, and Lars transformed from a simple villager into a heroic figure in their folklore. Children listened wide-eyed as their parents recounted how Lars had offered himself to the Draugr, standing resolute as the undead surged toward him. They imagined him as a glowing figure, surrounded by flames, commanding the spirits with a voice that echoed like thunder. His sacrifice became the focal point of their new narrative, a tale that would be passed down through generations, imbued with lessons of courage, unity, and respect for the past. But as the legend of Lars grew, so too did the stories of Ingrid. She became a central figure in the villagers' newfound appreciation for the old ways. her wisdom and guidance revered as sacred. The unmarked grave where Lars had laid flowers became a place of pilgrimage, with villagers visiting to pay their respects, leaving offerings of flowers and trinkets in gratitude for her teachings. "Remember, it was Ingrid who showed us the way," they would say, gathering around the grave, speaking softly of the lessons learned. "Her spirit lives on in every decision we make, every choice to honor our ancestors." As Lars watched the legend unfold, he felt a mix of pride and humility. He had acted out of desperation, seeking to protect the village he loved, yet now he stood as a symbol of hope and strength. He began to share the teachings he had learned from Ingrid, emphasizing the importance of connection to the land and the spirits that inhabited it. The villagers embraced these teachings wholeheartedly, incorporating them into their daily lives. They celebrated seasonal festivals, honoring the cycles of nature and the spirits of their ancestors. The past was no longer something to be feared, but a source of strength and wisdom that could guide them into the future. As the legend of Lars and Ingrid continued to grow, the village thrived in ways they had never imagined. They were no longer just survivors of a haunting. They had become a community bound by shared stories and values, standing united against any darkness that might threaten their way of life. In honoring their past, they had forged a brighter path for the future, one where legends would continue to thrive and inspire generations to come. As the seasons turned, the village thrived under the warm glow of new traditions and legends. The story of Lars and Ingrid had woven itself into the very fabric of their community, shaping their identity as a people who had faced darkness and emerged stronger. Yet, even as life flourished around him, Lars felt a subtle, persistent whisper that beckoned him back to the graveyard, a call that could not be ignored. One evening, as twilight descended, casting a soft lavender hue across the sky, Lars found himself wandering the familiar path to Ingrid's grave. He carried a small bundle of wildflowers, a ritual he had adopted to honor her memory, but this time he felt a sense of urgency thrumming through him. The whispers had grown louder in his mind, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, and he knew he had to heed their call. As he approached the graveyard, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt charged, electric, as if it held secrets just beneath the surface. Lars knelt at Ingrid's grave, placing the flowers gently on the earth. "I miss you, Ingrid," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your wisdom guided us through the darkness, but I fear there is still more to learn." The breeze picked up, swirling around him, carrying a soft voice that seemed to echo through the trees. "Listen, Lars," it said, barely audible, yet clear enough to send shivers down his spine. "The past holds more than just memories. It is a living force, a source of power and knowledge." Lars felt a chill wash over him, and he closed his eyes, allowing the voice to wash over him. "What do you mean?" he whispered into the dusk. "What more is there?" "The balance between life and death is delicate," the voice continued, growing stronger. "There are still those who suffer, lost between the worlds. They seek resolution, just as Bjorn and the others did. You must help them find peace." Opening his eyes, Lars looked at the grave markers around him. Each one represented a life lived, a story left untold. A surge of determination filled him. He had thought the battle was over, but perhaps it was just the beginning of a new journey. "How can I help?" he asked, urgency tinging his voice. "Gather the villagers," Ingrid's voice urged, echoing through the night. Share the knowledge and let them understand the power of remembrance. Only then can the lost find their way home. With renewed resolve, Lars stood up, his heart racing. He would not let Ingrid's final whisper fade into silence. He would share her teachings, guide the villagers in honoring those who had come before, and help the restless spirits find their peace. As he turned to leave the graveyard, a sense of purpose filled him. The night sky stretched above, dotted with stars, each one a reminder of the lives that had touched his own. Lars knew he was not alone in this endeavor. Ingrid's spirit would guide him, and together they would ensure that the memories of the past would light the way for the future. With the weight of his newfound purpose resting heavily on his shoulders, Lars returned to the village. Invigorated by the echoes of Ingrid's wisdom, he gathered the villagers in the square, where the vibrant glow of the bonfire danced in the cool night air. They had become a community forged by trials and triumphs, and now they needed to prepare for the next chapter in their shared story. As the villagers gathered around him, their expressions reflected a mix of curiosity and unease. Lars felt a surge of pride for the resilience they had shown, but also a tinge of fear for what lay ahead. He had witnessed the darkness that had threatened to consume them, and knew that lingering shadows could still haunt the edges of their lives. "I have called you here tonight," Lars began, his voice steady, "not just to celebrate our victories, but to remember those we have lost and those who still seek peace. Our past is intertwined with the spirits that dwell among us, and it is our responsibility to honor them." The villagers listened intently as he shared the teachings he had learned from Ingrid, explaining the significance of their connection to the land and the spirits that roamed the night. He spoke of the power of remembrance, how it could heal wounds and help guide lost souls back to rest. "But we must remain vigilant," Lars warned, sensing the weight of his words. "Just as we face the Draugr, there may be other spirits that linger in the shadows, waiting for resolution. If we ignore their presence, we risk awakening forces we cannot control." As the flames flickered, Lars glanced at the faces around him. Some were filled with hope, others with fear. He knew their journey would not be easy, but together they could forge a path through the darkness. They would create a tradition of remembrance, a ritual to honor the lost, allowing their stories to be told. The villagers nodded in agreement, a collective understanding dawning upon them. They began to share their own memories, stories of loved ones who had passed, and as they did, the fire blazed higher, fueled by their shared emotions. Each story added strength to their circle, weaving an intricate tapestry of connection between the living and the dead. But as the night wore on, a sense of foreboding crept in. From the edge of the forest, the villagers felt the weight of unseen eyes watching them. It was a chilling reminder that the darkness was never far away, lurking just beyond the light. Lars shivered but held his ground, knowing that the bond they had forged could keep the shadows at bay. The eyes in the dark were a testament to the unresolved past, but as long as they remained united, he believed they could face whatever came next. And so the village stood together, a beacon of light against the encroaching night, ready to confront whatever shadows awaited them, armed with the knowledge that the past, when honored, could illuminate their path forward.